Have you ever felt alone, not knowing who to trust? Have you ever experienced the weight of fear, that fear that always seems to accompany you? The good news is that, like King David, you can overcome this fear. He didn't do it alone. David had Jonath'S loyalty, a friendship so strong that he faced the greatest challenges and brought healing to his fears. Right now, I want to show you how true loyalty, like that of David and Jonath'n, can transform your fears into strength. By surrounding yourself with loyal people, you will discover that obstacles become lighter, and most importantly, you will never be alone on this journey again. Before we go to the video, just check if you are already subscribed here to the channel. Because on this channel, I will bring a series of content like this, which will be a lesson in life and faith. It was any day in the Israeli countryside. The sun hadn't set yet, but it was already beginning to spread over the horizon, staining the sky with warm shades of orange and gold. David was there, as always, herding his sheep, not knowing that day would be the beginning of something that would change his life forever. He was nobody important in the eyes of the world, just the youngest of a large family, simple, with little more than a name in the village. But on that day, something was about to happen that would make him a central figure in the history of Israel. The prophet Samuel had been sent by God to anoint a new king, a man after God's own heart, and no one imagined that this man would be David. When Samuel, obeying a divine order, arrived at the house of Jesse, David's father, he looked at the man's sons and thought, "This is the king, this is the chosen one." It turns out that even with so much expectation, David was still not among the sons of Jesse presented to Samuel. He was the youngest, the most forgotten. But the prophet, guided by the voice of God, asked Jesse to call the youngest the simple shepherd. And so, in an unthinkable moment, David received the anointing from God, being chosen to reign over Israel. As David prepared to face the challenges that lay ahead, something was happening in the palace. Jonath'n, the son of King Saul, was there, living with the power and responsibilities of being the heir to the throne. He was everything a prince should be, brave, strong, admired by his people. But King Saul, his father, was already beginning to feel the weight of insecurity, something you may have already experienced, a feeling that a threat is always around you, but without knowing where it comes from. This happened to Saul. He was beginning to feel that the throne might be at risk, and in his mind he associated this with David, the young shepherd boy, now anointed by Samuel as the future king. But what Saul didn't know was that God's plan for David was underway, and that plan was not just about the kingdom of Israel, but also about the people David would draw close to him. Jonath'n, the king's son, was one of these people. The moment David and Jonath'n met, something inexplicable happened. It was as if, even with all the weight of the circumstances, the two knew deep in their hearts that friendship had been prepared by God. How something much bigger was unfolding there without them knowing. Jonath'n looked at David and saw something no one else saw. A future king who, perhaps without knowing it, would end up being the leader Israel so desperately needed. And David looked at Jonath'n and saw a man of honor, someone with courage, someone who, without meaning to, could become his greatest ally. But above all, what united the two in that first exchange of glances was a bond of loyalty that would become unbreakable. Imagine the scenario. Jonath'n, Saul's son, about to inherit the throne, and David, a simple young man anointed by God to be king. A simple look between the two was enough for a true friendship to be born, a friendship that did not depend on titles, wealth, or position. It was based on something much deeper, loyalty. And that loyalty was the first seed that Jonath'n and David planted at that moment. What really matters here is the strength of this bond. True loyalty is not born from superficiality, social position, or what can be gained from it. True loyalty grows and strengthens in the simplest moments. Jonathan did not look at David with the eyes of a prince, he saw him as a friend. David, in turn, did not see Jonathan as someone who could become an obstacle in the future, but someone he could count on, someone with a heart similar to his own. Those two men, with such different realities, began to walk together, with a connection that went far beyond ordinary friendship. They were now linked by something much greater, something not even King Saul could understand. While all eyes were on the throne, on who would rule Israel, David and Jonathan were establishing an alliance based on trust, something that at that time seemed a rare luxury. And this bond of friendship and loyalty was tested very quickly, in ways that neither Jonathan nor David could have imagined. But while this was happening, their friendship continued to grow. And soon, Israel's future would be shaped through this mutual loyalty. Jonathan, with his wise gaze and quiet courage, knew that David's story was just beginning, and he wanted to be part of it. He knew that even though the throne was no longer his, he cared more about the kingdom of God and the promise that David carried. But what would happen when circumstances started to turn against them? When envy, insecurity, and pressure began to weigh on King Saul? Would the loyalty between David and Jonathan be strong enough to withstand all of this? Expectations are already starting to grow, aren't they? What came next would indeed be the greatest test of loyalty they could face. And this friendship, which seemed unbreakable, would begin to be put to the test in a way that no one imagined. Leave your opinion here in the comments. The scene was set for an epic showdown. The Israelites, God's people, were camped in the Valley of Elah, a vast plain between two mountains. On one side, the armies of Israel, led by Saul. On the other, the Philistines, with a warrior who was not only feared, but completely imposing, Goliath. A giant over 3 meters tall, with armor that weighed over 50 kilograms and a sword as sharp as the deadliest of blades. The mere sound of their footsteps caused the earth to tremble. He challenged the Israelites to send a man to fight with him, and whoever lost, the entire nation would submit to the other side. For 40 days, the giant Goliath went out every day at the head of the Philistine army, defying the Israelites, mocking their God and his people. He mocked, laughed, and in his hoarse and threatening voice, the soldiers of Israel felt powerless. It was a palpable fear which took over everyone's hearts, even the bravest of warriors. Every soldier's eyes shone with the shadow of fear. Each one feared not only for his own life, but for the fate of all of God's people. It was in this scenario of despair that David, a simple young shepherd, entered the scene. He was not a soldier, nor a warrior. He was the youngest in a large family, which meant his position was always the last to be considered. While David's brothers were there on the battlefield, fighting or fearing, David was at home, tending the sheep. However, he was sent by his father, Jesse, to bring food to his brothers and bring news of how things were going. It was a simple mission, but it would turn into something much bigger. Upon arriving at the camp, David found something he could not believe: the giant Goliath, once again challenging the army of Israel. But instead of feeling afraid like everyone else, something inside David ignited. He could not understand how someone who called himself a servant of the living God could allow a man to defy God himself in that way. The young shepherd, with his fervent spirit and unshakable trust in God, looked at the giant and saw only an opportunity to show the world that when God is on someone's side, there is no giant, no army, no force that can defeat him. And it was there that, even without being called, David presented himself before King Saul. "King Saul," said David, firmly, "let no one lose courage because of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight with him." Imagine the scene for a moment. A young man with no combat experience, no armor, offering to fight a giant that would make anyone hesitate. Saul, who already knew what David was capable of as a shepherd but had never seen him fight, looked at him skeptically. "You cannot go against this Philistine," said Saul. "You are just a boy, and he has been an experienced warrior since his youth." But David, with a confidence that was not his own, but came from something far greater, replied, "The Lord delivered me from the paws of the lion and the bear, and he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. For the Lord of hosts is with me." David was not just speaking empty words. He was talking about a trust he had built over the years in the field, tending his sheep. He knew that when his life was at risk from a wild animal, it was not his strength that saved him, but God's protection. Now he knew that this same God, the God of Israel, would protect him against Goliath. When Saul finally allowed David to go to the battlefield, something very curious happened. The king tried to dress David in his own armor. It was heavy armor, which barely fit David's body. He tried to walk with her, but soon realized that a king's armor was no use for a simple shepherd. David then decided to take off his armor and opt for something simpler, a sling and 5 smooth stones from the stream. He knew he didn't need more than that, because his trust was in something greater than any weaponry. His trust was in the Lord. And so David approached Goliath, who, upon seeing him, laughed contemptuously. He mocked David, calling him a dog, and wondering what he was doing there, without a sword, without armor. Goliath was right about one thing. David was not a traditional warrior. But that didn't matter, because David knew that his fight was not against flesh and blood, but against much greater forces. The confrontation between David and Goliath was not just a physical fight. It was a fight of values, of faith, of loyalty to the God of Israel. Goliath was relying on his size, his strength, and his weapons. David was trusting in the God who had protected his life in so many other battles. And when he approached Goliath, David was not afraid. He was not afraid of the size of the enemy. On the contrary, he knew that the Lord would fight for him. When David picked up the stone and placed it in his sling, he prepared for the most important battle of his life. He didn't need a sword or shield. He had something more powerful, the courage that comes from unshakable trust in God. David spun the sling and threw the stone with precision. The stone hit Goliath in the forehead with a deafening crash. The giant fell immediately, defeated by the strength of a stone, but even more so by the strength of a faithful God. As Goliath fell to the ground, the Philistine army watched in silence. They saw a simple young man, with no weapons or military experience, defeat the greatest warrior they had. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't understand, was that true power came not from human strength, but from divine strength. David's loyalty to God, who had sustained him in his life, and the courage to face the enemy without fear, was what led him to victory. It was not David's skill as a warrior, but his trust in God that brought victory. Jonathan, who was not directly in the battle, felt something inside him. He knew that David's victory against Goliath was not just a personal victory, but a victory for the entire people of Israel. Jonathan, with his unwavering loyalty to David, saw there confirmation of what he had always known. David was God's chosen one. And more than that, he knew that David did not fight alone. He was fighting with the strength of the Lord. And what came next, after the fall of Goliath, was not just a military victory. It was a young pastor's victory over fear, obstacles, and the expectations that the world placed on him. And at that moment, David's destiny was even clearer to everyone, including Jonathan. So, have you ever faced a fear or challenge that seemed bigger than you? How did you manage to overcome it? Or if you're still going through this, what do you think could help you move forward, just like David did when facing Goliath? Share with us in the comments. David had defeated Goliath resoundingly. He was no longer just the simple shepherd, but now he was the hero of Israel. The people celebrated his victories and praised him as a rising leader. Women danced and sang in the streets. Saul killed thousands, but David killed 10,000s. It didn't take long for King Saul to begin to understand what this meant. The adulation of the people, the shouts of joy, the acclaim around David, all of that began to hit Saul in a way that he didn't know how to deal with. Saul, until then a strong and respected man, saw his throne threatened. The idea of David becoming more popular than him and the people seeing the young shepherd as a future leader was like a sharp blade piercing the king's heart. He had been anointed as king by Samuel, but now the presence of David, anointed by God to reign in his place, began to cast doubt on his position in power. There was no more room for friendship, for camaraderie. David, who had once been his companion and friend, now represented everything he feared, a threat to the throne. Envy is a treacherous emotion. It is born from an internal dissatisfaction, from an insecurity that takes over the person and transforms them. When Saul looked at David, he no longer saw the brave young man who had helped save Israel, but rather someone who was about to take him from his throne. He could no longer see David clearly. The friendship, which once seemed unbreakable, was broken by the shadow of envy. And so Saul's persecution of David began. First, it was a matter of words and threats. Saul watched David, trying to find a reason for his anger. Then the persecutions began. Suddenly, David, who had previously been welcomed into Saul's court, was expelled from the palace. He became a fugitive, a man marked by the king's wrath. Saul, completely overcome by envy, sought at all costs to find David and take his life. But while Saul pursued David with blind hatred, what was happening in the heart of Saul's son Jonathan was completely different. Jonathan knew what was at stake. He knew, deep down in his being, that David was not just a friend, but God's chosen one to reign over Israel. He had seen David's anointing, heard Samuel's words, and knew that it didn't matter what his father felt. God's plan was underway, and David was part of that plan. Jonathan did not see David as a rival, as an obstacle to his own position as heir to the throne. He saw David as the future king, someone with whom he should walk, support, and help fulfill the divine mission assigned to him. It was difficult for Jonathan. He could have chosen the easy way out. As the king's son, he could have turned against David and sided with his father. He could have become Saul's right-hand man and put his future as heir to the throne above his friendship with David. The pressure of being the crown prince and the expectations placed on him were enormous. But Jonathan was no ordinary man. He was not guided by convention or by the fear of what he might lose. True loyalty for him was priceless. And this loyalty, which was being put to the test in moments of immense tension, became an example of friendship and courage. At that moment, their friendship was tested the hard way. Jonathan knew that his own father, the king, was after David. He knew that his father had become corrupted by envy and anger. Saul was determined to destroy David. So Jonathan made a courageous decision. Instead of allying with his father, he did the opposite. He approached David in secret and made a pact with him. He promised that he would do everything he could to protect David and help him escape Saul's wrath. This decision was a huge risk for Jonathan. He knew that by supporting David, he would be positioning himself against his own father, the king. He could be considered a traitor, someone disloyal. But the loyalty he had for David went far beyond concern for his own status. He understood that true loyalty is not measured by what is lost, but by what is gained in character and honor. Jonathan went to David, who was hiding, and revealed his father's plans to him. He knew that Saul was determined to kill David, and that the situation would become increasingly dangerous. But still, Jonathan did not give up. He swore an oath with David, saying, "And thou shalt do me good, as the Lord hath done unto thee, and as I have done good unto thee, so help me the Lord." They hugged there in the field, sealing a commitment of friendship and loyalty. Jonathan not only risked himself for David, but also demonstrated profound wisdom by understanding that God's will was over his friend's life and that he should be part of it, even if it meant a difficult personal decision. Jonathan's loyalty to David was not just a gesture of friendship, but a decision that would profoundly impact his own life. He knew that by choosing David, he was putting his own position as heir to the throne at risk. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew what he was doing was in line with God's will. He was willing to lose everything for a friend, for the one he believed in. And so, the bond between David and Jonathan grew stronger. David, who before was just a young shepherd, now had at his side someone who believed in his mission, someone who supported him without reservation. Jonathan, who could have had everything, power, riches, status, chose what was right before God. He chose to be faithful to David. What followed this alliance of loyalty was relentless persecution by Saul, but it was also the moment that showed the world the strength of genuine friendship. Jonathan's loyalty, which saw him sacrifice his own position for David, was an example of courage and commitment that few could understand. And in the process, they both found themselves increasingly connected, as if they were destined to face the adversities that lay ahead together. The persecution was just beginning, and Jonathan's loyalty would be tested again and again. But at that moment, when he chose to support David rather than ally himself with the king's power, he was already putting into practice a lesson that would last for generations. True loyalty is priceless, and she, however painful it may be, is more precious than any throne or earthly power. The road ahead for David and Jonathan would be difficult, and the challenges would only increase. But what was clear in that moment was that their friendship, built on the rock of loyalty, could never be destroyed. David's life had become a constant game of hide and seek. The young man who had been hailed as a hero, the winner of Goliath, now found himself at the mercy of the fury of a king who had previously treated him as a friend, but now wanted him dead. Saul's persecution not only put David in a position of constant flight, but it also took him away from his family and the security of what was once his peaceful life as a shepherd. The desert, that vast and arid landscape, became David's new home. It wasn't just the thirst for heat and scarcity of resources. It was a psychological, emotional, and spiritual wilderness where he faced loneliness and abandonment, and where his faith would be tested in ways he had never imagined. Yet in the midst of all this chaos, true loyalty seemed to blossom in an unlikely place. David, the former shepherd, now fleeing for survival, and Jonathan, the crown prince, who had been forced away from his father and the riches of the palace, met again in secret in that unforgiving wilderness, far from Saul's eyes. Their friendship, which had begun in the palace, was now stronger than ever, for it was founded not on past glories, but on something much deeper. The loyalty that transcends all circumstances, the loyalty that, without expectation of reward, is pure and true. David hid among the rocks and caves, trying to avoid the watchful eyes of Saul's spies. But, to his surprise, in the middle of that desert, where life seemed to be constantly escaping, Jonathan found him. He crossed mountains and crossed the vast desert to be with his friend. It was no longer just a comfort visit, but an alliance, a silent promise that their loyalty would not be broken, no matter the circumstances. Jonathan knew that his father, Saul, was completely consumed by anger and envy. Saul's search for David intensified every day. David was a shadow that hung over Saul's throne, and the king would not be able to rest until the young man was eliminated. Jonathan also knew that, as the king's son, he should be the heir to the throne of Israel. But when he looked at David, he no longer saw an ordinary man. He saw the man anointed by God, the one chosen to lead Israel. It was a difficult choice for Jonathan. His future as crown prince was at stake. If he were loyal to David, he would likely lose his right to the throne, and with it the power and security that came with his position. However, Jonathan did not hesitate. He knew what was right. He knew that Israel's future was not tied to its own status, but to the divine plan. And that's why he chose to stay by David's side, not just as a friend, but as an ally in a future that, even if it was uncertain for both, was in God's hands. And it was in this context of risk and uncertainty that Jonathan made his promise, a covenant of eternal loyalty. He and David met in a secluded place, away from all eyes, and there they made a commitment that was not just about friendship, but about something much bigger, a commitment to the future of Israel. They knew they were in a spiritual battle, and that their choices would not only affect their personal lives, but the destiny of an entire nation. Jonathan, without hesitation, swore a solemn oath. He promised David that even if his father pursued him to the ends of the earth, he would never abandon him. He pledged to be a shield for David, to help guide him in times of trouble, and to fight for him, always. No matter what happened, their friendship, the loyalty they shared, would be unbreakable. However, the most notable thing about this covenant was the sacrifice implicit in what Jonathan made. He knew that by supporting David, he was giving up everything he was once promised, the throne of Israel. He knew that by choosing David, he was giving up his position, riches, honor, and all the advantages that would come with being king. And yet he made that choice. He no longer saw the throne as something worthwhile. He understood that true honor came from following God's will, and that this meant supporting the friend chosen to be king, even if it meant the end of his own political career. The moment of his promise was full of emotion. Jonathan knew what was at stake, and David, with a heavy heart, could not believe his friend's generosity and courage. They embraced, and the desert, silent and lonely, witnessed one of the most powerful moments of loyalty, Israel. This covenant in the wilderness was not just a covenant of words, but a covenant of deeds. Jonathan knew that in making this promise, he was not just telling David what he wanted to hear, he was committing to act on what he had said. And it was this active loyalty, this willingness to put others before oneself, that made the friendship between David and Jonathan so extraordinary. They became, in that moment, more than friends. They became partners in fulfilling a divine purpose. The desert, which seemed to be the end for many, became the scene of a new beginning for David and Jonathan. They had sealed their covenant in a place of solitude, but this covenant would soon spread beyond the rocks and caves, touching the future of the entire nation of Israel. Jonathan's courage and their loyalty became the foundation on which David could build what God had planned for him. Meanwhile, Saul, unaware of the depth of the friendship and alliance that had been formed, continued his senseless pursuit, blinded by hatred and envy. But what Saul didn't know was that there was something stronger than his anger, the strength of true loyalty, something that could not be destroyed no matter how hard he tried. The desert, which seemed like the end of a dream, was actually the beginning of a story bigger than anyone could imagine. Well, we're already reaching the halfway, and I realized that you still have not liked this video. This is very important for YouTube to continue to provide our content to you, so please leave a like on this video, which is free. Saul's kingdom was gripped by tension. The king's pride and envy toward David had intensified to an unsustainable point. What began as a sincere friendship between the king and the young shepherd had turned into a deadly game of hunting and stalking. King Saul, who had already been warned by God that the throne of Israel would not be his for much longer, saw in David the definitive threat to his reign. With each David's victory, with each acclaim he received from the people, Saul's anger increased. And with that, the decision to kill David became more and more concrete in his heart. But what Saul didn't know was that even in the midst of his fury and paranoia, there was an even more powerful, silent, and unbeatable force. A strength that was priceless, that could not be bought with riches or power. Jonathan's loyalty to David was something that would transcend anything the king could offer. Jonathan knew that his father, driven by anger, would do everything to put an end to David, but he also knew that he could not allow himself to turn his back on his friend. Jonathan's heart was divided between love and respect for his father, the king, and unbreakable friendship for David, but his loyalty to David surpassed any moral dilemma. For him, David was not just a friend. He was the man chosen by God to lead Israel, and nothing and no one would make him betray this truth. Saul, in his blindness and paranoia, could not see what was happening around him. He didn't realize that his own son was silently making decisions that could cost him his life, all out of loyalty to David. Saul's plan to kill David was underway, and Jonathan, with his protective instinct and his awareness that his friend's life was in danger, would need to act quickly. That night, as the king prepared his deadly trap, Jonathan approached David with a look of concern and determination. The silence between the two was heavy, filled with a tension that only longtime friends can understand. Jonathan, with a serious expression, looked into David's eyes and said without hesitation, "My father, the king, plans to kill you tomorrow night. You are in great danger, but I will not let that happen." David, although he was already accustomed to the dangers that surrounded him, felt the weight of these words. The friend was willing to risk his own life, his own safety, to warn him. What Jonathan was saying was not just a warning, it was a sacrifice. Jonathan knew that by revealing Saul's plan, he was putting his own life at risk. If the king learned of his son's betrayal, the punishment would be merciless. Still, he didn't hesitate. His friendship with David was stronger than any fear or concern about the consequences. Jonathan knew that David's position was increasingly untenable, and he also knew that the time to act was now. The risk of losing David, not just as a friend, but as the future king of Israel, was becoming an increasingly palpable reality. He could not allow his father's anger to destroy everything they had built, a friendship that became a divine covenant, a pact of loyalty that would not be broken, even in the face of death. David, touched by his friend's courage, looked at Jonathan and knew that he was dealing with something that transcends all understanding. It was a sacrifice of life, a decision that could cost Jonathan everything he knew and loved. But for Jonathan, loyalty to David was non-negotiable. He knew that even if his life was taken away by his own father, he would never walk away from David. This was something that transcended simple friendship. It was a true covenant, a promise made before God. As the two discussed their plan to escape the imminent danger, Jonathan made sure David understood how serious the situation was. They needed to separate for a while. David should hide, flee, and Jonathan would take the responsibility of giving the last warning. Everything was heading towards a painful but necessary separation, and Jonathan's sacrifice became increasingly clear. The next day, as predicted, Jonathan presented himself at the king's court, knowing that the tension he felt could turn into a direct confrontation with Saul at any moment. When Jonathan spoke, trying to protect David, he knew his father would not react well. Saul's fury was about to be unleashed in a ruthless way. He looked at the king and in a firm voice declared, "I don't know what happened to David, father. He told me he won't be able to come to your table." It was there, at that moment, that Saul's true nature appeared. Upon hearing his son's words, the king exploded in anger. Those words of Jonathan were more than a defense of his friend. They were a challenge to the king's own authority, a direct opposition to Saul's plan to kill David. The king, overcome by fury, even threatened the life of his own son. He called Jonathan a traitor, and it was at this point that the tragedy occurred. The king was willing to sacrifice his own son because of his obsession with David. Saul's anger turned into a violent confrontation, and a heartbroken Jonathan understood that he had done what was right, even if it meant losing the affection and respect of his own father. His loyalty to David had cost him family harmony, and he would pay the price. But in his soul, he knew he had made the right choice. David, in hiding, already knew that the situation was out of control. He knew that the future would now be marked by separation. Jonathan had kept his promise. He would sacrifice himself to save David without question. It was the end of an era and the beginning of something even more challenging for the two friends. That day, danger approached, but their alliance, the loyalty they both shared, was stronger than any evil plan or betrayal. And when the reunion happened, their friendship would be forever marked by that sacrifice, which would prove true loyalty that would never be broken. It was a dark day, the kind of day that carries with it the feeling that nothing would be the same again. The battlefield where Jonathan and Saul faced the Philistines was in full eruption. The sound of clashing swords, the scream of warriors, the sound of arrows in the air, all of this blended into a symphony of chaos and destruction. But the worst was to come. The battle that seemed like a simple fight for the throne of Israel turned into something much more personal, more painful. And for David, this would be the day he would never forget, the day he would forever lose the friend who was always by his side. Saul, although already distanced from David and overcome with anger, was still king of Israel. Jonathan, his son, had been part of that fight, and there was no choice. The battle, lost to the Israelites, brought a series of tragic consequences. Saul and Jonathan died in that field, and with that, what was left of the royal family was decimated. Jonathan's death was a devastating blow for David, who would never have imagined that he would have to face the loss of a friend who had become more than a brother. It was impossible to find solace in the face of such a tragedy. There were no words, no comfort that could ease the pain David felt. David knew that the friendship he and Jonathan shared was not based on personal interests or the convenience of circumstances. No, that was something that transcended any kind of earthly situation. It was a friendship forged in the flames of loyalty, of respect and unconditional love that no one could destroy. Jonathan was not only his friend, but his soul brother. And his loss, which sounded like distant thunder, now materialized in a brutal way, consuming David in an indescribable way. The Bible shows us that David's pain was immeasurable. After receiving the news of Jonathan's death, David retired into deep mourning. He did not hide his suffering, and his words, written in the book of 2 Samuel, are a sincere testimony to the pain of losing someone who was so essential in his life. He said with a torn heart, "How the heroes fell in the midst of battle, Jonathan slain in the high places. I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. Your love for me was very sweet, more wonderful than the love of women." These words capture the essence of true friendship, a friendship that is not defined only by good times, but by loyalty that remains even in moments of crisis and separation. For David, friendship with Jonathan was a love like no other, something that could not be replaced by anything. He mourns not only the death of his friend, but also the loss of the connection they had, a connection that was not just of friendship, but of soul. When he calls Jonathan brother, he expresses the deepest degree of affection and trust that could exist. Jonath'S was not just a friend, but someone who walked with him like a blood brother, sharing both the victories and the most challenging moments of his life. For David, Jonathan's death represented more than the loss of a faithful friend. It was the loss of a life companion, someone who had helped him navigate his greatest challenges and keep his faith firm. even in the face of adversity. David was not only facing the death of Jonathan, but also the end of an era of mutual loyalty, of unbreakable trust. No matter what fate had in store for him, David knew that Jonathan would always be by his side, even if not physically. And that was now missing in a painful way. The way David deals with Jonathan's death is an example that true loyalty goes beyond earthly life. It is not limited to physical presence or daily coexistence, but remains eternal. Even when the body is gone, when words are exhausted and moments of closeness become memories, true loyalty never dies. It remains alive in the hearts, in the memory, and in the actions of those who in some way dedicated themselves to each other with authenticity. The story of David and Jonathan shows us that true loyalty is not an abstract concept. It is not just a beautiful idea that we talk about when we refer to friendship, but rather a living and powerful force which drives us to make sacrifices for others, to protect them, to support them in times of danger. The loyalty that David felt for Jonathan was not just a word he used to describe a passing feeling, but a truth that defined his life, his decisions, his attitude towards the world. And even when death came, David's love and loyalty for Jonathan did not diminish. The way David wept over Jonathan's death is a representation of something we can all understand: the loss of something that will never be replaced. The pain that David felt when he lost his friend was the pain of someone who loses something that became part of them, something that touched their life so deeply that it could never be forgotten. Jonathan's death, although tragic and irreversible, is not the end of their story. In many ways, it is the beginning of a new understanding of loyalty. David, when mourning Jonathan's death, was not only mourning the loss of a dear friend, but also reaffirming that true loyalty goes beyond time and space. It does not disappear when death comes, but continues to live in every act of remembrance, in every promise fulfilled, in every act of kindness that is perpetuated over the years. David's lament, deeply sincere, reflects what we all feel when we lose someone we love, a feeling of emptiness, a lack that seems impossible to fill. But at the same time, he teaches us that true loyalty is not shaken by death. It is eternal because genuine friendship and love have no end, even when the body is gone. Jonathan, for David, will always be the brother he never had, and his loyalty will be eternally remembered. David, in mourning the death of his friend, reminds us that true friendship, one that is based on loyalty and mutual commitment, has no end. Even in death, Jonathan's memory lives on in David's acts of loyalty, and that, my friends, is something that should be remembered and cultivated in our own lives. True friendship, unbreakable loyalty, does not end when death arrives. It endures forever, reflecting the love and commitment that transcend earthly life. What do you think of the loyalty of Jonathan, who stood firm with David, even though he knew it would mean defying his own father? Have you ever had to do something so difficult for someone in your life? Leave your opinion in the comments. Time had passed. David's kingdom was finally consolidated, but the memory of his dear friend Jonathan remained alive in his heart, like a flame that never goes out. Although death had taken Jonathan, the alliance between the two had not died. In David's mind and heart, the bond of loyalty he had made with Jonathan in those days in the desert continued to be the force that guided him in his decisions. As if David himself was driven by something deeper than the desire to rule a kingdom or win victories, he was determined to honor Jonathan's memory and fulfill the promise he had made to his friend to always take care of his family. And that was how the story of David and Jonathan, which many could consider an intense friendship, but limited to the time they both spent together, began to unfold in an even deeper and more powerful way. Even with all the adversities he faced, David never forgot the commitment he had to his friend, a commitment that, deep down, involved caring for those Jonathan loved, even when all that was left was the memory of a good and loyal man. What David did next is a testimony to how true loyalty goes beyond the moment and lasts for generations. When David was finally at peace with his kingship, he remembered the promise he had made to Jonathan. But instead of forgetting, as many would do, David wondered if there was still someone from Saul's lineage that he could fulfill his oath of care for. The answer would come, and it would change someone's life forever. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, was living in a very different setting. While David was now comfortable in his palace, Mephibosheth was in hiding, away from everyone, living with the pain of not only the loss of his father, but also the lack of mobility, as he was disabled. When King Saul and Jonathan died in battle, Mephibosheth, still very young, was taken by his nurse to a distant place, where he lived far from all the luxuries that could have been his. Although descended from a royal lineage, disability and abandonment made Mephibosheth's life an existence filled with loneliness and pain. He no longer had the title of prince or the perks of royalty. Saul's name was tarnished by death, and he, being the king's grandson, had become, in the eyes of many, just an obstacle in the path of a new reign. But something surprising was about to happen. When David learned that Mephibosheth was still alive, he immediately sent for the young man to his court. David's message was simple, but full of meaning. "Where is Jonathan's son, to whom I can show kindness for his sake?" This gesture by David, which seemed simple, was actually a reflection of a deep and eternal commitment to his friendship with Jonathan. By sending for Mephibosheth, David was pledging to honor his alliance with Jonathan, caring for his lineage, and offering what he himself values most, protection and loyalty. David knew that this gesture was not just a matter of generosity, but a demonstration of character. He was, in effect, saying to Mephibosheth, "You are not just Jonathan's son, you are one of my family, and what happened to your father will not be in vain." Mephibosheth, upon hearing the news, was perplexed. He didn't understand why David, the king now in power, would choose him, a man with nothing, who could offer nothing in return. Mephibosheth felt small, irrelevant, and approached David with a heart full of insecurity and doubt. "Who am I that the king should look at me?" he said. "I'm just a dead dog." Mephibosheth's view of himself was marked by shame and pain, which made his encounter with David seem even more touching. But David, in his wisdom and loyalty, not only forgave the fact that Mephibosheth was part of Saul's family, he welcomed him as if he were his own son. David restored Saul's land, gave him back his possessions and dignity, and ensured that Mephibosheth was treated with honor as a member of the royal house. He offered him a table where Mephibosheth himself could eat with the king, alongside his children and his family. David not only restored his inheritance, but also his dignity and love, things that many would never expect a man in David's position to offer to a member of his former enemy's family. This scene, full of symbolic richness, shows the type of love and loyalty that David was capable of giving. David's loyalty was not limited to the past or Jonathan's memory. She continued to live through her actions, and by offering care and compassion to Mephibosheth, he was telling the world that true loyalty isn't just about what you do for a person while they're alive. It's about honoring the promises you made to someone who's gone by doing what's right for those left behind. And that's what David did, with all his strength and heart. David's gesture of caring for Mephibosheth was an expression that true loyalty has no expiration date. It transcends moments of ease, overcomes difficulties, and perpetuates itself. David's loyalty to Jonathan created a legacy of kindness and love that not only passed on to the next generation, but also provided healing and restoration to those who needed more than material help. David's action with Mephibosheth was a clear demonstration that he understood the true value of commitment to care, protect, and provide, even when the person you loved is no longer around. Mephibosheth began to live with a new identity, an identity that was no longer marked by disability or loss, but by the grace and loyalty that David offered him. Jonathan's legacy, through David's loyalty, endured not as a distant memory, but as a living, palpable, transformative reality. And so, the story of David and Jonathan closes with a profound lesson. True loyalty is not limited to a time or a circumstance. It lasts through generations, extending to everyone who, with an open heart, accepts being part of this commitment. The friendship of David and Jonathan is not just a love story between two men, but an eternal legacy, a testimony that when loyalty is true, it continues to live, protect, and love, even in the absence of those who created it.